Hey there everyone, Benchy here from Beching&Gaming. Slightly different setting for the video today, so apologies in advance for any background noise you might hear throughout the rest of the video today. But for today we're going to be testing this, the Intel Core 2 Quad Q8300, which is a 2.5 GHz quad-core processor released back in November of 2008, which I picked up recently from eBay here in the UK for only £5.45. The interesting thing about the Core 2 Quad series from Intel, which I actually didn't know about until I started the video, was that these are actually two dual-core processors put together. Rather than just one die, which has 4 cores, it is actually two different dies with 2 cores on one chip. But given that the Core 2 Quad Q8300... That's a plane. But given that the Core 2 Quad Q8300 is 11 years old this year, just how does it perform in relatively modern games today? Stay tuned to find out. The Intel Core 2 Quad Q8300, as mentioned, released back in November of 2008, and it launched at a price of $224 US, which today, adjusting for inflation, is around $266 US, or around £219 or €239 at the time of writing, minus any relevant taxes. It was a 95W TDP quad-core processor that featured no turbo boosting or hyper-threading whatsoever. It was based on the Yorkfield 6M architecture, meaning that, like all other Q8000 series processors, it had 6MB of L2 cache, although 2MB of this is disabled. The remaining 4MB is actually split between the two dual-core dies, giving each pair of 2 cores 2MB of L2 cache each. It also has 64KB of L1 cache per core as well. It featured 456 million transistors, built on the 45nm fabrication process, and carried support for DDR, DDR2 and DDR3 memory. As I mentioned at the start, I picked this up for only £5.45 on eBay UK, although you can get it for £5.40 on there now at the time of writing. And in the US, you can buy it for as little as $5.29 with $2.27 postage and packaging. I'll be running the Q8300 through some benchmarks and some relatively modern games as well, to show you what an 11-year-old quad-core CPU is capable of today. But first, here's a quick rundown of the specs of the system the Q8300 will be used with, which features a Gigabyte GA-EP45-DS3L motherboard, 8GB of DDR2 RAM running at 800MHz, Windows 7 Ultimate 64-bit, and a Phanteks TC14PE cooler on the Q8300. All of the games and benchmarks will be run from a mechanical hard drive, separate from the hard drive that Windows is running on, and I've also disabled all of the power saving options in the BIOS as well, so let's get on with the test. As usual, to kick off the test for today is Cinebench R20, a multi-threaded benchmark released earlier this year, which is designed to render a photorealistic 3D image, using all of your processor's cores, spitting out a score at the end based on how long it took to render the image. To start off, I ran the benchmark a total of 3 times and averaged out the scores to get a fair view of what the Q8300 can manage consistently. I did this at stock clocks and with an overclock as well, which I'll get into in a bit. At stock, the Q8300 scored 573, 576 and 576 points in the 3 tests respectively, giving an average of 575 points. Now, for the overclock, I had no idea what an actual safe voltage would be, so I set 1.4 volts in the BIOS, which gave me an actual voltage of around 1.344 to 1.36 volts. I'll put the rest of the settings in the description down below. At these voltages, the Q8300 managed a core clock of 3.308 GHz, using a frontside bus speed of 441 MHz, which also put the memory at 882 MHz. And with a 32% increase in clock speed came a 30.55% increase in average score, with runs of 751, 752 and 749 points, for an average of 750.67 points. 3D Mark's Firestrike benchmark is up next, and I'm running the physics portion of it specifically, which will also be run 3 times and have its scores averaged out. At 2.5 GHz, the Q8300 managed scores of 4,259, 4,213 and 4,231 points for the 3 runs respectively. But with a 3.308 GHz overclock that I used in Cinebench R20, it had an average increase in score of 31.35%, with scores for its 3 runs of 5,554, 5,525 and 5,593 points respectively, giving an average of 5,557.33 points. Getting into the games, first up is GTA 5, which released on PC in 2015. I'm running the test at 1080p using DirectX 11 with the lowest settings possible and 16x anisotropic filtering. Overall, the game ran well enough to still be playable, but it did have a few issues. At stock, throughout the city, the Q8300 managed to get FPS around the mid-30s up into the low 50s, whereas the overclock pushed the FPS up into the mid-60s with lows of around the mid to high 30s, and had only one occasion where there was noticeable stuttering. Thankfully, neither test showed any kind of input lag or locking. Moving further out of the city, the micro stuttering at stock clocks becomes more apparent, with the overclock not really managing to fix it, as the stuttering was still noticeable throughout the game. The game seemingly ran smoothly on the highway heading towards the desert, but once there, both tests showed more micro stuttering at times, although overall, the overclock has definitely reduced the amount of stuttering. Stock clocks showed average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 43, 24 and 17 frames per second respectively, and several spikes in its frame times of up to around 60 milliseconds and a couple of up to 80 milliseconds. The overclock pushed the average up a decent amount to 50 FPS, although with 1% and 0.1% lows of 24 and 17 FPS respectively, it's obvious the game still has issues with stutter. Next up is onto Warframe, available through Steam or the Warframe website itself. I'm running this at 1080p in DirectX 11 mode as well, using the high settings preset but with 8x anisotropic filtering and depth of field, anti-aliasing and motion blur disabled, and the test is being run in a survival mission on Jupiter. I was expecting decent results given that I've managed to run this game to a playable level with dual-core processors in the past, and it was a pretty good showing in both tests. Stock clocks had FPS on the lander craft in the low to high 140s, up to the high 190s at best, and showed no stuttering or locking up here at all, whereas the overclock managed to better this, as you'd expect, with figures in the low 150s up to as high as the mid 210s. Maru's Bazaar was another story though, with both tests showing a significant amount of locking up going into the area, as well as when you're walking about amongst the other players too. Although, to be fair, I'm sure my own system with an i7 6700K and GTX 1080 have trouble with locking up here too. Performance in the mission itself though was fantastic in both tests, other than a bit of noticeable stuttering at the start of the test at stock clocks. FPS here would hit as high as the high 160s up to the low 170s in the least detailed areas of the map, with the overclock pushing highs up into the low 180s. Neither test showed any issues with stuttering or locking up at all throughout the whole test. The benchmark at stock clocks showed average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 77, 51 and 34 FPS respectively, and had some spikes in the frame times of around 40 to 80 milliseconds, and one of 160 milliseconds. The overclock on the other hand showed a reasonable improvement with average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 82, 57 and 41 FPS, with only one spike in frame times of 40 milliseconds and none more of any kind of significance. Moving on to Rise of the Tomb Raider, and I was kind of expecting some reasonably bad results, although to be fair I've never tested any other quad core in this game other than my own 6700K, so I guess I wasn't really sure what to expect. And despite the issues it has, I was pleasantly surprised with just how well the Q8300 managed. At the start of the test, overclock had the game running pretty smoothly, with only one dip to 30 FPS happening, but with minor but noticeable stutter when it happened. Stock clocks though had some dips below 30 FPS, with minor but noticeable stuttering when the dips happened as well. Neither test had any kind of input lag or locking at all, and combat wasn't affected by the minor stuttering either. There was some quite noticeable stuttering at points though, which the overclock was affected by too, although thankfully not to the extent that it affected gameplay at all. Both tests showed stuttering when turning the camera in the Soviet installation, with stock clocks showing worse stutter here as you'd expect. The same is true for both tests when in the copper mill area too, with the stutter being a bit worse at points here than it was in the Soviet installation. There was also a weird issue that I've only ever seen once before, where the side mission in which you're asked to clear out the wolf den for one of the injured villagers doesn't start. You just don't get the option to accept the quest at all. That aside, the benchmark for stock clocks showed average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 45, 21 and 13 FPS respectively, with the overclock managing 52, 25 and 19 FPS for its average 1% and 0.1% lows respectively. Stock clocks had several spikes in its frame times reaching around 60 to 70 milliseconds, more of up to around 115 milliseconds, some around 210 to 260 milliseconds, and the worst coming in at 2.08 seconds. The overclock also had several spikes of around 50 milliseconds, more of up to around 85 milliseconds, a few more of around 240 to 360 milliseconds, and the worst coming in at 1.9 seconds. Lastly, it's on to CSGO, our Counter-Strike Global Offensive. For this, I'm also using 1080p, but with medium settings and 16x anisotropic filtering enabled. The test is being run in a hard difficulty competitive bot match on the Mirage map. Neither test had any issue whatsoever throughout the entire test, other than some minor, but noticeable stutter when you first get into some close-up combat. Stock clocks at FPS in the high 40s up into the high 160s at best, with the overclock managing around the low 60s up as high as the low 180s. Neither test had any issues with input locking or lagging, and overall both tests showed the game to be playable with or without an overclock. Stock clocks managed average, 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 92, 52 and 33 FPS respectively, with some spikes in frame times of up to around 40 milliseconds and some more of around 120 to 200 milliseconds. The overclock managed average, 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 116, 64 and 42 FPS respectively, with some spikes in frame times of around 40 milliseconds and some more of around 90 to 140 milliseconds. Overall, I'm actually really impressed with how well the Q8300 holds up today, despite being an 11-year-old CPU now. In GT5 for example, with an overclock, granted it does still have issues with stuttering, it remains a playable game, or it at least performs well enough to still be playable and enjoyable. Games like CSGO and Warframe as well, for example, even without an overclock perform perfectly and you'll never notice any problems in it whatsoever, other than the issues I mentioned in Miru's Bazaar, which much more powerful hardware has problems with anyway. Rise of the Tomb Raider, I would say, is probably the most surprising. I've had quite a lot of trouble getting that running on older processors before, but like I said, this is 11 years old and I was expecting it to perform pretty badly, but it didn't. It does still have its issues, but it's still playable and still enjoyable. So yeah, like I said, I'm quite impressed with how well I did, and considering I only paid £5.45 for it, I'm certainly not sorry that I bought it. Before we finish up today, I'd like to give a special shout out to Patreon supporter TazFeDodge, or @TazFeDodge on Twitter, for making all of this possible. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a comment and a like, and subscribing to my channel if you'd like to see more content like this, and maybe even sharing the video with people you think may enjoy it. And although there's no obligation to do so, you can support me in creating these videos through my Patreon at patreon.com/Beching&Gaming, or through Ko-fi at ko-fi.com/Beching&Gaming. But thank you for watching my video. It means a lot of you would take the time to watch my content. Hopefully I'll see you in the next one.